A couple of weeks ago, I released the first episode in the Myth and Ritual series. In that episode, we took a look at the idea of myth and ritual and the myth and ritual complex. And we talked about how these words, myth and ritual, we sort of have to let go of our cultural connotation with those words for a brief moment and take a journey and allow ourselves to discover and explore different understandings of those words and ideas. The goal was that in coming back to our way of using those words, it would enhance and expand our understanding of them, and in this way, it would give them a bit more depth and significance in our lives. So now that we've explored just a little bit the idea of myth and ritual as an interrelated complex, there are certain specific ways that we can implement these ideas into our daily lives. I happen to know that a lot of the people following along with these videos are spiritual people at different phases in their spiritual connection. Some of us are still trying to understand the role that spirituality plays in our lives. Some of us are really struggling to understand the significance of our actions or to be present, while some of us feel entirely comfortable in not just our spirituality, but in our daily practices related to that spirituality and in our rituals. Regardless of where you are in that spiritual connection, I feel like after our last video, where we reframed the idea of ritual and saw it from an anthropological view, that we can get insight to keep in mind as we formulate daily intentional actions that we call rituals for people who are just starting and don't have those things in place. And it can also allow us to rethink the rituals that we do have in place and reframe those actions and even change them when necessary. And this is especially true if you feel like you're someone who's already pretty well grounded in your spiritual practice or understanding of things. Our common understanding of what a ritual is and its purpose is pretty clear and widespread, but there's always room for us to change this understanding as we gain new information. The first thought that I had after our last myth and ritual video is that rituals should be specific. As we talked about in the last video, myth, as seen through the lens of people in ancient Greece, meant more of the idea of an aggregate of truth for a particular culture or a society rather than a fiction. In this way, myth comes to represent the idea of the collective, and since getting a tangible understanding of myth involves individual manifestations of that collective, ritual then comes to represent the idea of the individual. This means that myth also represents a more metaphysical realm, because the idea of the collective relates to a sense of the larger cosmic structure of things, and as a result, ritual represents the physical realm, which is the individual manifestation of the metaphysical realm in ways that it presents itself to us in those physical ways. But the idea here is that to make something as specific as possible is to make it as much of an individual as possible. This might not seem like it makes that much sense, but if you were to take the opposite approach and not make something specific, right, then you would be generalizing that thing. When you look at it from this way, right, to generalize something is to purposely make it less individual. For a funny example, if you were to say Marcus is a black man, and that's how you see me, I see Marcus like a black man, then you're not really seeing me as an individual. You are generalizing me and your view of me in order to put me into a category and to make me less specific and less of an individual, but say, you are a part of this collective that is black man. But to specify your view of me and say, Marcus is a black man who values wisdom and truth. He has a unique perspective on culture and anthropology. He is an ancient Greek nerd. Then you are starting to see and respect me as an individual. And the way that you're doing that is by specifying the attributes and qualities and interests that I have. So to truly capture the idea of the individual would be to make that individual as specific as possible. And so to truly encapsulate the individual that is represented by ritual, the ritual itself should have as much specificity as possible. The reason that ritual should embody the idea of the individual as much as possible goes back to this interrelationship between ritual and myth. If these are two parts of an interrelated functioning complex, then in order to function as optimally as possible, both of them need to fully embody the sides that they embody as much as possible. So the ritual will need to embody the individual as much as possible and do its role as much as possible and allow myth to do its role so that the two of them have this proper functioning interrelationship with each other. So in a way, to fully embody this myth and ritual idea then would also mean that the role of the myth should take on as much of the collective as possible. I'm honestly not exactly sure what that means yet, and if you have some ideas, I would love to hear them, and it's something that we'll definitely explore and I'll think about a lot. But what I would guess is that having myth embody the collective as much as possible would definitely entail an exploration into what truth is and truth itself, and an exploration into universals and human universals to really figure out what exactly makes up a collective connection between us. The point is that when embodying the idea of the individual through ritual and fully embodying the idea of the collective through myth, the end result would be us performing as specific an action as possible to represent as universal of a concept as possible. I also feel as though it's really difficult to think about even our modern understanding of ritual without thinking about the word intentional. Even some people who aren't as interested in the spiritual side of these ideas are in places in their lives where they're trying to make their actions more intentional. So for a funny example of this, imagine that you bought me a birthday present, but you didn't really buy the present specifically for me. You just bought the present and didn't really intend to give it to me, but you happened to give me that gift at that time. It would be really difficult for you to convince me that that gift had any sort of intentionality behind it and that it was intentionally for me. I mean, you literally did not intend to give it to me. You just intended to get it and give it to someone. It's funny because it seems obvious in this scenario that to give an intentional gift is to give a gift that is specific to the needs and preferences of the person that you're giving the gift to. This idea of specificity and intentionality is actually why I'm, maybe surprisingly, a big fan of people joining specific religions and of people being proud to say and claim that they are this religion or that specific religion. These religions already have individual narratives that relate to fundamental truths, and they have socially established actions or rituals that relate to and recreate those individual narratives, and therefore are a recreation of their understanding of those fundamental truths. There are actually so many other reasons why I'm a big fan of joining a specific religion. A lot of those having to do with your ancestors and starting your spiritual path and places where it left off and where you have connection, things like that, that I'll definitely talk about in other videos. But when it comes to the idea of spirituality, that's honestly the problem that I have in even saying that I'm a spiritual person. And in making these videos, I had to come to terms with using this word spiritual and spirituality and to say that I'm a spiritual person. Because a lot of times the way that I see spirituality being used lacks specificity, and even more so is purposely generalized to give the impression that you are more connected to a spiritual energy because it's not specific to one individual religion or one individual practice. Whereas for me, it's not just about being like, oh, I'm spiritual to the spirit in general. This action that I'm doing is special because I made it up to be that way and because I just feel like it has a connection to something larger. So in my opinion, a lot of times this idea of spirituality doesn't really take into account the sense of intentionality and the sense of specificity the way that I think it should. The second thought that I had about ritual after our first myth and ritual video is that rituals should be special. There's actually a whole lot to cover as far as special actions and non-special actions, or marked actions and unmarked actions as it relates to ancient Greece and anthropology. But a lot of the ideas I want to talk about now actually tie over from the last point. If a ritual relies on specificity and individuality, then another important component of ritual is differentiation. So the thought is this: if the goal of your ritual is to create a sense of significance for that action, well, things gain their significance through their relationship to and distinction from other things and actions. For example, if there's a culture that has a ceremonial tea drinking action or ritual, well, this ceremonial tea drinking ritual gets its significance and meaning in how it's similar to your regular tea drinking and how it's different. Even a moment of presence and intentional mindfulness in your day is significant because of how it's just like every other minute that passes through the day, except something about it was done to make it markedly different. In this way, you're separating this action out from the rest that are like it and making it special. This can be seen even in things that some of us already do relating to ritual. For example, we even distinguish, and in this way, we make special areas in our house and physical spaces that are designated for our rituals. We consider our rituals to be special actions and therefore think that they should take place in special spaces in our house. And these special spaces are special because they are places in our houses that we have somehow made different from other places in our house. And in doing so, we made them special. If I have, say, a painting ritual, there is a specific place in the house where that painting ritual usually takes place, where I do my painting at. Or if not, then there's usually something that I do to the space that I always use that makes it different than it usually is. For people that like to do yoga, your yoga corner or your yoga room is a place where when you're in that corner, it's for an intentional action to take place there. I think the yoga corner or room is actually a great example because yoga specifically is something that is commonly understood for us, that when you're participating in it, there is a sense of how your physical aspects relate to a metaphysical aspect built into that practice. So the act itself is an expression of the relationship between a cosmic whole to a particular singular entity, and a part of that is the space in which it takes place. That specific corner is understood by you to be a place where metaphysical and physical realms meet when you participate in the ritual that is yoga in that space. There's a lot more that I can say about spaces and rituals and specificity, especially related to ancient Greece as far as performance and Greek theater, and even just temples and spaces in general as they appear in ancient Greece, and that's something that we'll talk about at some point as well. The third thing about ritual is that it should be living and breathing. We talked about Homer and how the Iliad and the Odyssey were actually a composite of localized myths and traditions that occurred through a process of variation and a process of recreation through oral transmission that ended up being the Iliad and the Odyssey that we know today. Ritual, as those individual and physical iterations, gives life to myth, and each physical iteration is going to have a natural variation as it progresses in time. This means that new rituals are born through the evolution of old ones. We talked about the Baha'i faith and the idea that each Messiah is a manifestation of God to those specific people. Well, that idea is at play there too. See, as people change, the way that they are capable of coming into contact with the cosmic structure changes as well. We change not just as cultures and societies, but of course as individual people too. So the idea is that you should allow your rituals to have localized variation, where the locale for that variation is one person, and that's you. As you practice your rituals on a day-to-day basis and gain intentionality and an understanding of significance, you should be in this process of clarifying your relationship to a cosmic whole, and you should be able to change and move as you interact with it and as you learn more and as you understand more. As your lens and the way you see the world changes, which it should as you practice your rituals, it should give you a clearer understanding of cosmic truths, and the way that you interact with those cosmic truths through your ritual should have changes as well. It's important to note, though, that it's not about trying to just invent your own truth and then reaffirm that truth that you made up through your daily actions and try to say, well, I'm doing these daily actions that relate to this truth that I made up, so it must mean that the truth is true, and it must mean that my actions relate to that truth, right? That's not necessarily the case, but it is about understanding that there are truths and that participating with those truths will take into account your perspective as a unique person and the way that you would interact with those truths. This is something that we'll talk about a lot as we get into interpretation and the idea of objective and subjective truth. And of course, when we talk about Plato and the theory of the forms, because if you know me, I'm a big Plato fan and nerd. I'm not a relativist type person, that believes that there is no truth, truth doesn't exist, or that truth is literally just whatever we think it to be in our minds at that time or something like that. As you can imagine, when it comes to my views on objective and subjective truths, I'm all about the proper integration of those two ideas. I believe that there is an objective truth. I believe that there are true forms of things and of ideas, but I believe that those objective truths present themselves to us and reveal themselves to us in our specific subjective ways as unique individuals and cultures and societies and places in time. As this relates to those specific religious institutions that we talked about before, this can often be a challenge and a criticism that people have towards religious institutions. It's that they can be very rigid and unforgiving when it comes to the individual process of coming to truth and of practicing ritual. And I don't disagree with this at all. I actually think that religious institutions could definitely benefit from understanding this idea, and they could benefit from understanding what their role could be in facilitating this individual process and fluidity of that process for the practitioners of their religion. At the same time, it's extremely difficult to navigate that approach when what you're attempting to do is literally trying to create a large institution to connect people to these fundamental truths. It's going to be difficult to have a large institution that is doing that and is playing the roles that it's playing while also trying to constantly be moving and changing with each individual and each individual culture that comes into contact with it, especially if a part of what you're attempting to do as a religious institution is embody the idea of a collective truth. Then you don't want that institution and the structure of that institution to be fluctuating at such high levels and high volumes just based off of the whims and desires of the individual people at that time. You always want to try to stay somewhat grounded in what you have, but still be open to that change and to those small differences and listening. I mean, to be honest, that's the problem that I have in a lot of institutions and a lot of political ideas and economic ideas that purport to be about the collective or claim to be about community or try to form connections between people, is that they oftentimes don't properly take into account the fact that individuality does make up a component of reality. And this ties back to one of the main points of this video and of these videos in general. What we're really trying to do is get rid of this one or the other mindset when it comes to individual or collective or physical and metaphysical or this opinion or that opinion, or I like religion or I don't like religion. There's a one or the other mindset. I think that if we can get over and get a sense of integration between these opposing dichotomies, that I think that we can really start to grow and flourish within ourselves and within our societies and our cultures. But even to make that change on an institutional level will require us to do that within ourselves. And so here we are with these videos thinking about how this sense of collective and individual integration can be accomplished in our everyday lives by thinking about the idea of myth and ritual. I hope that this was helpful and that your mindset around rituals is now fluid enough to take these ideas into consideration. Rituals gain their power through their deep connection to unchanging truths, but they gain their endurance through fluidity, and you and I and our mindsets and our paths are the same. Thank you.